Hello and welcome back to another episode of Everybody Hates Your Brand. And in this one, we're talking about the creative arts and being neurospicy with Natalie Howells. It's an interesting two-part interview today with Natalie. As an experienced copywriter, we're going to be talking to her about getting great creative work, how to write a great brief, the role of AI and more. But then also as the author of the book, Yeah, But How Though? Personal development for the neurodivergent, we're going to jump headlong into that world as well. Should be a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it. So, as I said in the introduction to this podcast, we are delighted, say we, it's just me here, but delighted to be joined by Natalie Howells. Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited. This is my first podcast.
Well, look, it's very kind of you to join. So thank you for coming on and having a chat today. We always start with what I call the credibility section, which is basically a chance for you to introduce yourself and your career so that people around the world that listen to this podcast get a bit of a context for your opinions and why we're talking about the subjects that we're talking about. So could you give us a sort of brief history of Natalie Howells, please?
I will try and keep it brief. I'll try and do that with my answers throughout. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. So, as you said, I'm Natalie. I am a copywriter, primarily content focused, creative person. I've worked with brands including Disney, McDonald's, TUI, Nationwide. Some very, very posh brands that nobody's ever heard of because none of us are rich enough to know about these brands. And I am obviously not going to out my age, but I've been doing this for a really long time. I've written a couple of books, I've published one of them, and I know we'll talk about that a bit later on.
Indeed, we will.
And so I've worked agency, in-house, all over the place across the UK, but with international clients as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think this is a kind of a two-section interview, I guess, two quite distinct sections. The first section, we're going to talk very much about your career experience around creative and copywriting and just pick your brains on how marketing, client marketing and agency people can get the best out of their creative teams, whether that's in-house or agency side or whatever it is, and what works for you, what doesn't, all that kind of stuff. And then the second half, we're going to talk about your book around, as you title it, neurospiciness, which is a great phrase that I'd not heard until I'd read your book. So we'll get onto that section a little bit later on. Let's start with the creative section, which is always fascinating to me as somebody who isn't particularly creative when it comes to these kind of things and how people's brains work like yours. The one adage that's always been true in marketing is that great creative starts with a great brief. So let's start creative where it's supposed to start, with a decent brief. There's an interesting discrepancy in the perceptions of client marketing teams' ability to write a good brief. There's a piece of work, I think it's from the IPA, but I could be wrong, Better Briefs, that 80% of marketers agree with the statement, I consider myself good at writing briefs, and only 10% of creative agencies agree, which is a pretty bloody stark difference. So, question, is that something you recognize and agree with? And if so, what are the things you see, the biggest pitfalls you see when receiving briefs from clients or even people like me, planners and strategists in agencies? And what makes a great brief from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely recognize that discrepancy. I wouldn't have pegged it as quite such a stark difference, but it's definitely something I recognize. And I think for me, one of the big pitfalls when getting briefs from clients is that they assume in-house levels of knowledge. I've worked with clients where a brief came in with, we want this content here, we want this content here, and then here, just general messaging. Now, I don't work for your business. I have absolutely no idea what you mean by general messaging about any topic, because I don't have a guide to your general messaging. So I think that kind of lack of context, and for me, the biggest thing that makes a good brief is context. I want to know why.
Right.
If I don't know why we're doing this, it's so much harder. And
Mm.
the context of, what the client wants to achieve, obviously with room for a creative approach on how to achieve that,
Hmm.
but also any non-negotiables, because sometimes you'll get back and say, oh, but we also have to do this. We always have to do it this way. That's great.
Yeah.
Put that in the brief. If there's anything that's absolutely definitely got to be covered, that needs to be in the brief. Again, a brief needs to assume zero industry knowledge, zero client knowledge, even though you would obviously hope that your agency does have some knowledge,
Yeah.
but you need context as a creative. Having structures and guardrails doesn't diminish creativity, it
Mm.
expands it. Because if you give me free reign, that's too many options. I don't know what to do with
Yeah.
that.
I've heard that phrase before, that like there is nothing more terrifying to a creative than a blank piece of paper,
Yeah,
because it's
absolutely.
like I need something. Otherwise, as you said, you become paralyzed with, well, God, where on earth do I start?
Yeah, exactly. So not putting things in that are rigid structures because you want to give creative freedom
Mm-hmm.
is actually counterproductive. Put those
That,
structures in, because then the first draft is going to be closer to what you're looking for.
that's a really interesting tidbit, I think, to that not a lot of people would think about. I mean, I always, when I was writing creative briefs, it is always that concept of, don't be overly. I suppose the difference between being detailed and being prescriptive.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
don't want to be prescriptive too much, in the sense of like, I want it. Like if I was working with an analyst, I wouldn't say I want this graph to be this and I want this piece of it. And like, this is the question I want answered. You figure out how to answer that question. But I'm going to give you as much as I know about the question, and I'm going to frame that question the best way I possibly can to help you get to the answer. And I suppose it's a
Yeah,
similar thing.
absolutely. Um, but you absolutely have to include this information in the graph, and you absolutely cannot include this information in the
Yeah,
graph.
yeah.
Um, or even, I'd really prefer it if this wasn't or was included, because that constraint will come up later, and it just means redoing some work rather than crafting the work.
And if a client, in my experience, if a client says, and I've been a client, if I want, oh, you can, I'd really like this, but don't. What they really mean is, put it in, because if
Yeah,
you don't put it in, I'm going to
absolutely.
come back around to it.
Yeah, you've got to have an impeccable reason for not, if they've mentioned it, even in passing, as something they'd like. If you have an impeccable reason for not, they'll still be disappointed, but they generally will understand. But yeah, always assume those kind of little throwaways should just be in the brief.
Okay, so let's say you get a brief that's half decent, and you write your first piece of creative, or you and maybe an art director partner create something, and you present whatever it is that you're presenting, a nice piece of DM or an email or whatever it might be. Um, what's your advice to clients when giving feedback on, especially on copy, but on creative in general? Like, are there do's and don'ts to get the most out of your relationship with the copywriter? Like, I have a bad habit, as well, having worked together, of sometimes the only way I can get across what I'm trying to say is by writing the thing that I want, like a piece of copy, in a sense. And I always feel bad doing that, because I feel like that's not the best way to do it. So, what's your advice on giving feedback on copy and those kind of things?
Yeah, so I will say, I never mind someone suggesting something, as long as they understand, and you always did, as long as they understand that this is the vibe I'm going for, this is what I'm aiming for. I'm not saying rewrite it exactly this way. And I think there are two ways that kind of feedback comes in. One is, this is the vibe, and one is, do it like this. Do it like this isn't the best way to get something out of your copywriter. They may have very good reasons for not having done it that way, but my main advice ties into it, which is, be specific, as specific as you can in your feedback. I have had clients over the years, hundreds of different ones, just highlight something, say, not keen on this. Honestly, it's incredible how often it happens. And that's the least helpful feedback it is possible to get. Because I don't know what you don't like about it. If there's a particular word you just don't want to use, I don't know that. So I may rewrite that sentence and still use that word because I thought it was actually the grammatical structure you didn't like or the tone you didn't like. So not keen on this, least helpful. If you'd highlighted that and gone, I'd like this to be more like, and then given an example, then I can see what you're getting at. Because not everyone has the language to be able to give feedback directly and say, the tone of this doesn't quite work. It's too short, it's too choppy, it's too long, it's too wordy, whatever. So if you don't have the language or you're not entirely sure what it is you don't like about something, giving an example is a good way to express that without knowing how to express it.
Yeah.
And I've worked with designers who've given me that kind of feedback where they've kind of gone, I'd really like it to be something like this. I know that's not what you're going to write because I'm not the writer, you are. And as long as there's that level of respect that I'm not trying to do your job for you, I'm trying to give feedback in a way that is helpful and gives you what you need from it. So
yeah,
that's the
and
thing.
I think that's fair. And I also think it needs to be a two-way thing in the sense of the client needs to be sometimes maybe more be open. Don't go in with a preconceived idea of it was this in my head, and because it's not this, it's not right. That there
Yes.
are alternative ways, many ways to skin a cat, as the old saying goes. That I think that's something that sometimes happens. People have a preconceived notion of this thing in their head, and then it's not that, and it's like, oh, that's quite a jarring thing for some clients, I think, and people in general.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why having that conversation in the brief about this is what I see in my head is helpful, because then we can soften that jarring. I think the big thing around that is more mature is going to sound like the wrong word, but clients who are experienced at working with external creative teams, so that type of maturity, will have a level of understanding that this is not their subjective opinion that they're feeding back on. That they may not like that sentence, they may not like that headline, but the tone of voice works, it fits the brief, and most importantly, it appeals to the target audience. I've written for brands where I'm not the target audience, and there is writing I've done that I don't like subjectively because it's not for me. And often it's a level of education from a creative team to a client that is, okay, you don't like it. That doesn't mean it's bad or wrong.
100%. And I think that's one of the great things from a CRM perspective is that I remember reading an interview with somebody who was a former copywriter, and he worked with a client who said, I hate the way this sounds. I hate the way it looks. I hate the font we're using. If you change any of it, I'll fire you. Because it had been proven to be super successful and that's that again, that maturity, I think, of which you speak, I think is a really important part of that. Which is kind of interesting leads me on to my next question, which is around something that's always been a bit of a bugbear for me, around tone of voice guidelines. Because a tone of voice guidelines should, if they're any good, give the vibe that be helpful in creating the vibe that you're going for, right? And should be a yardstick you can use to measure creative against, copy against. But all too often, I see tone of voice as a section on a brief, and it just says jargon-free, human, and open, which just feels like useless. So to me, but then I'm not a copywriter. So my question is, what in your view makes useful tone of voice guidelines? What are some of the best ones you've come across?
Yeah, I love a good tone of voice guideline. If it is one page in the overall brand guidelines, it's not good tone of voice guide. Just as a benchmark, the amount of times it is a single page in the overall brand book, you won't get enough information. Jargon free is a useful term because that does tell me something helpful in the copy. It tells me how I need to approach industry specific terminology, and it tells me something about the audience. Human and open could mean so many different things to different people. And the point of a tone of voice guide is to reduce subjectivity. So any phrases like that, they're too subjective, they're too open to interpretation. So for me, a good tone of voice guide is one that includes examples. So when you say human, you mean uses this type of language, doesn't use this type of language. And the this, not this is really helpful because, again, it reduces subjectivity. Because I've read tone of voice guides that say it should be playful. Okay, my interpretation of playful is going to be inherently different to someone 20 years older than me, 10 years younger than me. Playful changes. But if it's playful by including pop culture references and tongue-in-cheek, snarky comments, but not memes or not cheeky, okay, I think I've just described an impossible to achieve tone of voice there, but the example stands. So yeah, one of the secret clients that I mentioned, so they're a high-end travel brand, and when I say high-end, they deal with the staff who organise the holiday of the very wealthy family. So that's why I said none of us have heard of them because we do not have butlers. But their tone of voice guide was very comprehensive and it included context. And I know I've said that word a lot and I will say it more because for me, context is everything. So they wouldn't just say, don't use this term, they would explain why, which is amazing because then I can extrapolate. Because a tone of voice guide can never cover every eventuality, otherwise, there would be no need for a copywriter. So, this is a travel brand. In the tone of voice guideline, the list of banned words included the word excursion. It explains excursions are something you do on a package holiday. We don't do excursions. We don't do off the shelf. These are bespoke experiences. So you could have experiences, you could have expeditions, you couldn't have excursions. Amazing, because now I know why. And it also means I'm probably not going to use the word tour as a catch-all for going out. You may tour a vineyard, but the experience is not going to be described as a tour. And that word wasn't in there because there are contexts in which it works, but I can extrapolate because I know why. And yeah, that was the best tone of voice guide I've seen. I also love it when you have the house style included in the tone of voice guide. So things like how you write dates, how you write distances or sizes or any of those, do you use title case, do you use sentence case? All of those little style things that get picked up in a later edit. I'd much prefer them to be correct in the first edit.
That's fascinating. I feel like I need to have a conversation with you off air about this particular company because it sounds fascinating. The thing that always kind of bothers me about I think copywriting especially gets it more than most, is that because most people can type and or write.
Yeah.
They all think they can write copy. And in my experience, that's very much not the case. And it's now almost becoming worse in the sense that you don't even have to write your own copy anymore.
Yep.
You can go to ChatGPT and it'll churn out as much copy as you want. And it makes me uneasy. Lay my own cards on the table here a little bit. And when we were sending through the questions, we send questions through to the guests so they know I don't surprise guests with questions. There was the quote from Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park around AI kind of struck me, and it was this. I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourself, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it. I should start banging the table like it does in the film, and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it, and that's kind of how I feel a little bit about generative AI. It's standing on the shoulders of people who've created amazing things. But that's my opinion. You're the copywriter. What value have you found in AI? Maybe as like a writer's block unblocker or any of those kind of things. What's your perspective on the generative AI phenomenon and how it interacts with your job and how you're using it?
When I read the questions, any podcast that gives me an Ian Malcolm quote as part of a question is immediately my favorite. So, and that quote, the particularly "you didn't earn it," makes me think of something I read, and I can't remember where, so I can't credit the person who said it. But if nobody could be bothered to write it, why should anybody bother to read it? Which, like I said, it kind of goes along with the unearned side of things. And so I fully agree with that. If nobody could be bothered to write it, why do you expect people to spend their time and effort to read it? I think I have seen plenty of impact in copywriting from generative AI, obviously. I think it's affecting more people at a junior level and more people who would be working for smaller businesses, because those are the businesses that are seeing immediate savings from not having to pay a freelancer to write something. They can, have something in 10 minutes. There are tons of issues with AI, and obviously we're not here just to listen to me rant about AI for ages. But the fact is, as it stands at the moment, all it's doing is amalgamating and putting everything together and spitting out the average, because they're LLMs, they're language models. So it's a prediction machine, not a creation machine. And so it goes, okay, in this context, what's the most likely next word to go here? So all it's doing is watering down all of the creativity that's come before it into an average. So in my view, anyone relying on generative AI for copy is just in a race to mediocrity. Plus, it's going to start aggregating its own mediocre copy, and it's just a cesspool. So I would never deliver to a client, to a business, to an employer generated copy. That said, I think it would be naive to dismiss it and to not use it in any way. I think having an understanding of it and understanding how to get something useful out of it is almost going to become necessary, particularly for people like me, so that we're not disadvantaged. So I do dabble. I don't use it a lot. The environmental issues do concern me. And anything that I put into it is generic, anonymized, because once you put something in, you've given it data and you have no control over that information. So I would never put in, if I wanted to write a press release, I wouldn't be putting in the details. It would be company A and company B are now working together on project D.
Yeah.
But you mentioned unblocker, and that is definitely a useful thing. So if I'm struggling to come up with the right word for something, and it's because there's not a direct synonym, so none of my synonym checkers have been able to give me something, like I need a word that sort of conjures up this kind of vibe, or give me 20 headline examples to replace this terrible one that has just got stuck in my head and won't go away, and now I can't come up with anything else. And nothing it spits out has ever been, that's the answer. But it's given me other avenues and sparked something else. And then I've gone on to do something completely different. So that's how I use it. Like I said, I do use it sparingly. I want people to trust me and the work that I produce. And I don't think they can do that if it's not work I have produced.
I think that's a very what's the word? It shows a lot of integrity, and it'd be interesting to see how it goes. You know, we had my old boss from Australia, Simone Blakers, on the podcast a while ago talking about AI, and she's a huge evangelist for it. That's too strong a term, but she's talking about how it's being used to transform businesses. But we were talking about that idea of it becomes a race to the middle. Everyone's going to sound the same. So even if you put tone of voice and you feed it what you normally sound like, it's still going to be I don't know, almost like a pale imitation of it, I think. And and also it infuriates me that AI models are being trained on people's work without
Yes.
any kind of recompense for that, which kind of winds me up a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah. Copyright issues in every possible direction.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, look, I am going to blow the rest whistle and say that's the first half over. So we're going to change ends. This is a stupid analogy. Switch it up a little bit. As I said in the intro, you, as you said, you've written a few books. Your published work is called "Yeah, But How Though: Personal Development for the Neurodivergent," and I read it a couple of weeks ago, and I found it really fascinating. A really practical, useful, tangible set of ways in which people who are neurodivergent can manage careers and manage working and overcome some of the typical issues, or not typical, is not the right word, but some of the things that come along with being neurodivergent. And it was so fascinating. I wanted to kind of talk about that now. And the phrase that you wrote, which again I'd never read, which I loved, was the word neurospicy. I don't know if that's a you invention or if
No, it's not. It's I'd love to take credit, but
it was
no,
ChatGPT's. No kidding.
yeah. No, it's one I came across when I was researching neurodivergence. Some people don't like it. So
Okay.
just as a disclaimer, I do, because it means I can refer to neurotypicals as neuroblands. And, because I need something.
I like that. Now, you've obviously written this from the perspective of being neurodivergent yourself. So how and sort of when did you recognize that you were, as you put it in the book, neurospicy?
So I've always known that I didn't quite fit in. I was always a bit of an oddball, a bit awkward, always had my nose in a book, didn't make friends easily, struggled with things that other people seemed fine with. But neurodivergence was not something that ever crossed my mind. It was actually post-pandemic, because now I will caveat this with I was very privileged in that I had a stable job and none of my friends or loved ones were affected by COVID. So that's a really important disclaimer. But I loved lockdown. I thrived in lockdown. It was amazing, like I said, because I didn't have any of the negative effects. And after lockdown, coming back out into the world was so beyond difficult that it shocked me. Like, I know a lot of people, neurodivergent and neurotypical, who sort of went, oh God, I feel slightly agoraphobic after not having gone out for so long. But everything was difficult, way more than I could understand. So I started doing some research, and everything I put into any search engine was like, oh, yeah, neurodivergence. And I was like, well, no, because I only knew the stereotypical neurodivergence, which was can't sit still and is late for everything for ADHD, and good with numbers, can't talk to people for autism. So I wasn't those things. Therefore, it took a while for it to sink in that adults present differently to children, women present differently to men, and actually there's a much larger spectrum. So I did lots and lots of research and went, oh, this actually does answer all of my questions and explain my entire life.
That must have been quite the revelation.
It was, yes. It was mind-blowing. And I don't say that lightly, to just go,
Comforting in some ways.
yeah. Essentially, I had grown up, it's an analogy I've seen used before. I grew up and everyone was a horse, and I was really shit at being a horse. I was the worst horse. I couldn't do jumps. I didn't like eating grass. Just a terrible horse. And then someone came along and went, yeah, you're a giraffe. You should never have been able to do all the horse stuff because you're not one of those. Come over here, look, see all these giraffes doing exactly what you're doing. It's like, oh, I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm just built different.
Well, that leads to my next question, which I think is really interesting around the common misconceptions. Because as you said, you held them yourself before you'd done the research around being neurodivergent, especially in the workplace. There's a great quote from your book, which is, being underestimated is something neurodiverse people contend with a lot. When people know about our diagnosis, they often overlay expectations and judgments about what we can or can't do as a result. So what was your perspective when you could give a label to how you felt, and how do other people take it when you talk about that label and that idea?
Yeah, so I think particularly, I recall we're similar age, so particularly our generation and anyone older, it was very much ADHD was naughty boy syndrome. That was the only stereotype. That was the only, for a long time, that was the only diagnostic criteria. So there are often times when I say to people that, oh yeah, I have ADHD. Oh, don't act like it. And because their perspective is, well, I'm not interrupting and jumping up and down and unable to sit still and turning up late for everything. They don't know all of the other symptoms. They don't know all of the other challenges. Most people are pretty open to hearing more about it. But I think because I'm late diagnosed, I spent the majority of my life coming up with ways to cover up my symptoms that obviously I didn't know were symptoms. I just thought they were, my inherent deficiencies. So I had to keep covering them up. So you wouldn't necessarily know that I have autism, that I have ADHD, that I'm struggling with all of these different things because, and in the book, I talk about lots of different tools and techniques to help, many of which were tools and techniques I'd employed to cover up, and didn't realize that they helped me. And I think it's difficult knowing whether or not to disclose neurodivergence to an employer, because if I forget something, that, oh well, yeah, she's got ADHD, she can't be trusted to remember anything. If you forget something, it's just, oh, I forgot that, because it doesn't have a weight to it. Everyone forgets things sometimes. Everyone is late for things sometimes. But if people know that you have a diagnosis, then all of a sudden normal behaviors are seen through that lens. So I think those are some of the common misconceptions that you have to deal with. So I'm often praised for being very organized, which whenever it happens, I have to try and keep a straight face because look inside my brain because that's just a swirling mass of chaos. But I have to be organized because otherwise that chaos bleeds out into every aspect of my life.
Yeah, it makes a huge amount of sense. And in terms of, I say the book's amazing, and I would say it's not just for people who are neurodivergent looking for help. I think if you're a quote unquote neurotypical or neurobland, which I do like, and you have employees, you have friends, you have family, I think you can learn a lot from reading it. It's a really valuable set of insights. Was it just that you felt, okay, my medium that I express myself in is words for my job? This is something I can do to help people. What was the trigger for actually writing the book in the first place? I'm always fascinated by people who, my wife has written 3 books, and there's something about when you say I've written a book, people take that shit seriously because they know what a labor of love it is. So I'm always fascinated by what was the thing that made you think I'm going to sit and write about this.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for the compliments about the book. I have heard from neurodivergent people who've given it to their partners and said, read this, you will understand me better, which is just beyond insane to me, that this is just shit I wrote down, and that it's affecting people and changing people. The first trigger for writing it was that I was procrastinating and didn't want to. I was redecorating and I had to strip some wallpaper and I didn't want to. So I wrote a book, which is...
Nobody ever really wants to strip wallpaper.
No, they don't.
No one wakes up in the morning and thinks, fuck yeah, I'm going to strip some wallpaper today. But I like the way you're thinking to get around it.
Yeah. And also, when you say I've written a book, there's some credibility there.
Massively.
I am a bit of a weirdo. I love public speaking. I really enjoy public speaking, and I'm discovering really enjoy talking on a podcast. So, and it's much easier to get gigs doing those kinds of things if you have a book. So that was the thing that popped into my head. Like, if I write a book, which is very self-serving. But the other thing was I got diagnosed and I hyper-focused on learning everything I possibly could, because that is, a symptom. And so I gathered huge amounts of knowledge and intel. And exactly as you said, I express myself through writing. It's not just what I do for a living, it's who I am as a person. And so it seemed like quite a fun thing to do. And I don't think I expected anyone other than my mum to read it. And I certainly didn't expect the reaction I've had from people who've read it. I recently did a talk at a local sixth form. One of their librarians read it.
For the non-British people listening, sixth form is 16 to 18-year-old kids.
Thank you. The librarian had read it and then bought 10 copies for the school library because they felt it was an incredible resource for the neurodivergent students they knew about and those who were as yet to discover their neurodivergence. And they asked me to come in and speak, which was phenomenal. And the response I got, the librarian told me she changed one of her teaching methods based on my book. So she'd always
talk about validation. That's amazing.
I just stood there going, it's just stuff I wrote. The imposter syndrome was overwhelming because it was like, who gave me the right? But then the students went, she told us about this thing and it's made such a difference. And my life is now easier, which is not what I expected when I set out to do it.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's to have that effect on people. I can't imagine. It must be hugely gratifying.
Huge.
And I say it's a really great book. I wanted to kind of go back really quickly in relation to something you said about the pandemic and the idea that I've always been thinking about, and is that prior to the pandemic, the world is built for neurotypical extroverts largely. I think it was about coming into the office, it was about being sociable, it was about doing all these things. And then the world changed, and all of a sudden those people went from not struggling at all because the world is set up for them, to really struggling because they're at
Yeah.
home doing Zoom calls and all those kind of things. And I think there was a quote from your book which kind of talks a little bit about the impact it had, and then coming out of that, the impact it's had, which is that, again, to use your words, after working from home for an extended period, thanks to the pandemic, going into the office seems harder than it was before. For most of us, we got used to not masking, and it's uncomfortable to put the mask back on. We're talking metaphorical masks here before, not physical masks,
Yeah.
given what we all went through. Thinking about it as quote unquote impression management helps me reframe it as something I'm choosing to do for a specific purpose. I'm in control of it. It's not something that's happening to me. Impression management also gives me agency of what and how I mask and with who. So can you talk a little bit about that, the idea of impression management and the toll it takes? And then sort of second question to that, do you worry that this, I think, slightly bonkers drive to return to office is potentially going to impact neurodivergent people in a negative way?
Yeah. So I did rebrand masking as impression management. And I think one thing that's really important, particularly if people aren't aware of it, because like you said, we're talking about metaphorical masking, not wearing a little face
Yeah.
mask, is we all change who we are in different scenarios. I don't behave the same way in an office as I do with my friends or with my mum or with my niece. We all change things. That's not what masking is. Masking is essentially things like sublimating your sensory needs, consciously modifying facial expressions and tone of voice, scripting conversations in advance, and not just big ones, like even the most basic interactions, avoiding reacting to negative stimulation. Essentially, trying really hard to cover up any of your differences or challenges. So, like, I cannot stand the sound of someone eating an apple. Like, that is a sensory nightmare. It is wet and crunchy, and and you can't eat it quietly. And that's not no fault of the person eating the apple, but it makes me want to tear my skin off. And and I'm genuinely not exaggerating. And masking is sitting there, dying inside, typing away at your laptop and trying not to react to that, because that person doesn't deserve me looking at them like they're disgusting because they're doing a normal thing. So, as you can imagine, that's an all day, everyday thing. Or I should say, from the moment you walk into the office to the moment you leave, that is just on the whole time. And someone said something, is my face doing the right thing? What type of response should I make in this scenario? They've said, how are you? Remember that that is small talk. That is not actually asking how I am. Do not go into a diatribe for the next 20 minutes about everything. But then they start a 20-minute diatribe about their commute. Remember to ask them a question and not respond with my own story, because neurotypicals read that as making it about me. And that is what is going through your mind every second. And so it is exhausting. It takes a massive mental toll. And unmasking is doing things like saying, hey, I'm going to go and work over there for the next 10 minutes while you eat your apple because I have some sensory issues around that.
I'd like to keep my skin on my body.
Yeah, yeah. I would like to not enter fight or flight every time someone walks past my desk. So there are times when it's safer to unmask, times when it's not. I'm not going to say to the CEO, your aftershave is really bothering me. No offense, but I'm going to go and change desks, because that's not. Yeah, to be fair, actually, I have worked with a couple of CEOs that would have been fine with that, and I've worked with others that you wouldn't dream of saying that. So I think return to office mandates, particularly ones that are 3-4 days a week, will affect neurodivergent people. They'll also affect disabled people, parents, carers, and plenty of other people. But going from not knowing about this pre-pandemic to having the ability to just get on with my job and not have to have any of these thoughts because I was working from home to back in the office, a couple of days a week isn't too bad for me. Different people will have different thresholds. I rebranded it as impression management just to try and give myself some sense of agency and kind of go, actually, I don't care what this person thinks about me. Their impression of me is irrelevant. Therefore, I don't need to go through the whole process. Or this person already knows me well enough to know all these issues. Therefore, I can choose. So it's semantics, but words mean things to me particularly.
They do indeed. They do indeed. And I think that's it's a really eloquent way of putting it. I think the return to, I feel like we learned some lessons during the pandemic that are being forgotten in the rush, in some old-fashioned rush to get people back into the office for 5 days a week, which to me makes no sense. I'm not suggesting fully remote is the answer. I think 2-3 days, and 2 ideally, but 2-3 days in the office makes a huge amount of sense.
Yeah.
But it's just this peculiar thing that people want to go back the way it was, and I feel like we learned that it doesn't have to be like that, and it can be better. But hey, that's a bigger conversation for potentially a different podcast. So we are going to wrap this up with the patented, well, it's not patented because somebody did it before me, so I can't really say that. The Everybody Hates Your Brand Room 101, the room where you can suggest something to be put into purgatory for all time, and can be related to marketing, can be related to business, that kind of thing. So I invite you to tell me what would be the thing that you would lock away in room 101 if you could.
Okay. So when you specified marketing or business, I thought, so eating apples in the office can't be that.
Well, so, I mean, I feel a bit bad doing that one. I'm not going to lie. As somebody who has eaten the occasional apple in the office.
Yeah, I know, that would be unfair. So my room 101 is the LinkedIn marketing discourse echo chamber.
Ooh, good one.
Because
I like that.
It's such an echo chamber, and anytime there's a big thing, it just fills up LinkedIn. And the reason I think it needs to go into room 101 is it's marketers talking to marketers about marketing with absolutely no thought about the real world. And I think the biggest example of that recently has been Liquid Death, which everyone raves about. It's so clever, it's so innovative, it's blah, 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 blah. And it's pulling out of the UK due to low sales. If you just looked at LinkedIn, this has to be the most successful company in the world, right? It's not. It's just the echo chamber, and it has no bearing on reality.
There's a lot of self-congratulatory stuff going on, and the other thing, it's absolutely going into room 101, because the other thing that I see that drives me up the wall is, what can this thing that's just happened in popular culture teach us about marketing? Sometimes the answer is fuck all. So let's not try and crowbar it into the marketing discourse and all that kind of stuff. That if I ever see something that says, what can this teach? I'm probably sure I've fallen foul of that before
I was just about to say,
scours my LinkedIn profile and sees. I'm sure that's absolutely happened, and I apologize for it if that has happened. But that sort of stuff winds me up. So yes, I think that's absolutely fair. I think LinkedIn's become a bit of a, I don't really know what it's for anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like its utility.
It's for personal branding.
Yeah, I mean, I post about this podcast
brackets on it. Pejorative. There's nothing wrong with personal branding.
No.
But the way it is on LinkedIn feels, I'm going to say, it gives me the ick. And we can go with why millennials shouldn't use Gen Z slang as as something else that can go into 101.
Well, as a Gen X, I definitely can't do that. So look out for the LinkedIn post about this about this podcast going live.
I will absolutely be sharing it.
Nothing wrong with a bit of hypocrisy. Well, look, Natalie, it's been genuinely a fascinating conversation. Thank you for spending the last hour or so with us, and thank you for coming on the podcast. I will post your book in the show notes so people can go, and I urge people to go and get it and read it. To give you the name of the book, it's called Yeah, But How Though? Personal Development for the Neurodivergent, available at all good online bookstores, digital or physical. And again, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a blast.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that podcast with Natalie. I found it a wonderful chat and a fascinating pair of subject matters. The next podcast hopefully will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, a little bit of a shorter gap hopefully between this one and the next one. And in the meantime, take great care and be vigilant out there.